Hello everyone, welcome to Last Stand Stories. We leave the fables behind and focus strictly on the dark historical facts on the Little Bighorn.
Gunpowder smoke settled over the valley. The last gunshot echoed and faded away forever. The deafening roar of the clash suddenly ceased. It was replaced by a heavy, freezing, and absolute silence. The date was June 25th, 1876. The hills above the Little Bighorn River smelled of warm blood. The sun beat down on the hill at a steep angle through the dust cloud. The smoke slowly began to disperse. 210 corpses belonging to the American 7th Cavalry Regiment lay among the tall grass. The most elite unit of the world's most modern army had been wiped out in minutes. Custer and his men were no longer soldiers. They were merely flesh and bone. The valley was no longer a battlefield. In seconds, it had transformed into a massive, open-air autopsy table. Shadows emerged from dust and smoke. Tribal women, elders, and surviving warriors began to infiltrate among the dead. Their steps were slow. They were not in a hurry. There was no outburst of anger on their faces. There was no frantic intoxication of victory. Their task was not yet over. The real work was beginning at that exact second. They held no rifles or tomahawks in their hands. They carried stone knives, obsidian cutters, and bone needles. These tools were not for committing murder. They were there for a spiritual surgical operation. There was no random looting. They scattered among the bodies with a systematic order. One or several people crouched next to each corpse. The dead eyes of the American soldiers stared at the sky. The tribal members did not look at them with hate. They approached with cold-blooded, detached, and clinical attention. The procedures began. The first cut was made. There was no sound in the valley. Only the dull, wet rustle of knives meeting skin could be heard. This was not a ritual of revenge. It was a cosmic security procedure. The belief system of the Plains Indians was clear. There was a very thin membrane between the physical world and the spirit realm. However a warrior died in this world, he would pass into the next world in exactly that way. The final state of the body as it fell to the earth determined the eternal form of the spirit. Merely killing the enemy in this world was grossly insufficient. They would confront them again in the spirit realm. Therefore it was imperative to urgently neutralize that spirit. The enemy had to be disarmed. Mutilation was a necessity. Every cut inflicted on the body was a freezing seal stamped upon the afterlife. The corpses were examined one by one. The procedures adhered to a strict protocol. The bodies on the grass were no longer human. They were merely biological materials that urgently needed to be processed. The women's hands did not tremble. They acted with clinical knowledge passed down from generation to generation for centuries. Their steps were highly measured as they moved from one body to the next. The burning heat of the battle had given way to a surgical coldness. Blood seeped into the soil, but the focus of the operations was not blood. The focus was anatomy, muscles, tendons, and limbs. The wind blew. The grass rustled. This rustle was the only sound in the valley. The soldiers' bodies were gone, over inch by inch. They were examined the way a surgeon examines a cadaver, laid out on a table. The objective was clear. The enemy's physical capacity was to be eternally destroyed. The spirit would carry the biological devastation the body sustained forever. The 210 men lying on that hill must never be a threat again. The white man's army fought with steel and gunpowder. But the rules of this war were entirely different. The conflict was being waged on a cosmic plane. The tribal women were the ruthless enforcers of this plane. They were not savages. They were the architects of the afterlife. The scorching heat of the sun bore down upon the corpses. Flies began to gather at the smell of fresh blood. Nature's own cycle was at work. However, the tribal members worked with a mechanical rhythm, independent of nature. Every movement had a precise purpose. There was not a single scratch made in vain. Every stroke that flayed the skin aimed to shatter the spirit's armor. Every deep cut that reached the bone tore down the enemy's fundamental pillars in the next world. The valley had turned into a massive anatomy laboratory. There was no mercy in this laboratory, nor was there sadism or hatred. Only an absolute pragmatism prevailed. In the plain's belief, the spirit did not immediately leave the body at the moment of death. It lingered around that mound of flesh for a while. This brief window was the only remaining chance for intervention. The tribal women were racing against this time. They worked at a fast but unhurried pace. Obsidian knives gleamed in the sun. When the knives struck bone and dulled, new ones were quietly drawn. The process required continuity. Each of the 210 bodies had to be processed with the same meticulousness. No discrimination was made. Ranks were meaningless at this stage. Officer and private were equal on the autopsy table. The spirits of both were equally dangerous. The expressions of terror on the soldiers' faces were frozen. The fear they felt in their final moments was etched into their muscles, but this fear meant nothing to the tribal members. Emotional connection or empathy was absolutely out of the question. They acted like a carpenter shaping wood. The human body was a raw material being worked upon. The chaos of the battle had been left behind. Order was being restored. This order was not a military discipline of the kind the white man understood. It was the bloody construction of a universal and religious order. The bodies were turned over, arms were spread to the sides, legs were straightened. Each corpse was arranged in the most optimal position for the procedure. This was not a show of respect. It was strictly an operational necessity. The pools of blood on the grass were growing larger. However, this blood was not a byproduct of violence, but the inevitable consequence of the applied method. The tribal women were not interested in blood. Their business was with muscle structure and nerve endings. Their business was to irreversibly destroy the motor functions of the body. Silence blanketed the valley like a heavy shroud. Ears deafened by gunfire now heard only the sound of stone scraping against bone. This dull sound mingled with the howl of the wind. To an outsider, the scene on the hill might have looked like total chaos, dismembered bodies, naked flesh. But from the inside, everything was proceeding with a flawless choreography. Every woman knew exactly what to do by heart. Centuries of tradition were facing their final and greatest test that day on the hill of the Little Bighorn. Custer's soldiers had never encountered such an enemy in their lives. They knew death only as the cessation of breath. According to Christian belief, the soul separated from the body and went to its God. The body was given to the earth, left to rot. That is why for the American state what was done to a corpse was merely an insult, a primitive display of savagery. Yet confronting them was a mechanism that viewed death not as an end, but as the beginning of a new war. And this mechanism had no intention of leaving any advantage to chance in the new war. The shadows began to lengthen. The midday sun was giving way to the cool of the late afternoon. The procedures continued uninterrupted. The 210 corpses were slowly changing shape among the grass. They were stepping out of human form and transforming into spiritual wrecks. The women's hands were covered in blood up to their elbows. They did not even attempt to wipe the drops of blood splattered on their faces. Their focus was in a state of absolute concentration. When the procedure on one body was finished, they silently moved on to the next. These transitions were rhythmic. They operated as smoothly as the gears of a surgical machine. The valley was not just a field of death. It was also a penal center. But this punishment was not being dealt for crimes committed. It was applied to prevent crimes that could be committed in the future. The afterlife was an uninterrupted continuation of the war in this world. The enemy was white there too. He rode horses there too, and fired rifles there too. Defeating them in this world was not enough. Maiming their spirits was an obligation. Every second experienced on that hill was a direct consequence of this ruthless logic. Soldiers of the most modern army were being condemned to eternal mutilation under prehistoric stone knives. Within that absolute silence, not only the bodies of an army, but their eternity was being torn to shreds. The first and most critical anatomical target was the hands, the right hands of the American soldiers. The tips of the obsidian knives were directed straight to this area. Specifically, the right index finger was targeted. The procedure was highly specific. There was no random severing of limbs. The tip of the knife was inserted into the joint. The cartilage tissue was separated. The bone was broken. The trigger finger was completely severed from the body. This was not simple torture. It was a direct intervention to the center of that mechanical movement that fired the 1873 model Springfield carbine. It wasn't the hand holding the weapon, but the finger pulling the trigger that was the true weapon. Without that finger, the rifle was just a heavy lump of iron. The war would continue in the spirit realm, but an American cavalryman without a trigger finger would be utterly defenseless. They were tossed among the grass onto the dirt. Their ties to the body were cut. The spirit's armory had been emptied. They were left there as pieces of meat that had lost their function. Disarmament was only the first step. The second stage was the destruction of mobility. The focus shifted to the legs. The greatest strength of a cavalry unit was its speed, its maneuverability on horseback. The Plains Indians knew this very well. It was mandatory to reduce the enemy's speed in the afterlife to zero. The knives came down on the ankles. The target was the Achilles tendon, that thick, vital connective tissue at the back of the leg. A sharp stroke of obsidian cleaved the tendon in two. The biomechanical bridge between the heel and the calf was destroyed. This cut was not lethal. The corpse was already dead. But for the spirit, this blow meant a state of eternal paralysis. A spirit with a severed Achilles tendon could never walk again. It could not run. It could not step into the stirrup of that phantom horse in the spirit realm and climb into the saddle. It would be condemned to crawl on the ground. Deep horizontal cuts were slashed into the hamstring muscles behind the soldier's knees. The bending and pushing functions of the legs were anatomically canceled. Muscle fibers were separated from each other. The 210 cavalrymen lying on the valley floor were being sent to the next world, not only disarmed, but also crippled. The same clinical dismemberment was applied to the arms. Bicep muscles and forearm tendons were targeted. Swinging a saber required strength. Aiming the barrel of a rifle at a target demanded muscle tension. Knives carved deep gashes into the inner parts of the arms. Nerve networks were destroyed. The arms fell lifelessly to the sides. Those arms could no longer lift any weight. Every cut inflicted on the body meant tearing off and discarding a piece of the American military machine. The tribal members worked like an engineer taking apart a complex engine. There was no emotion. There was only the cold anatomical knowledge required by the procedure. The military doctrine of the American Army viewed the body as a tool, a disciplined, uniform machine of obedience. The Plains belief, on the other hand, accepted the body as a direct mirror of the soul. The more this mirror was scratched, the more deformed the reflected spirit would be. The word savagery falls utterly inadequate to explain this situation. There was no spiral of violence. A systematic spiritual security procedure was being executed. This procedure aimed to smother a potential future threat before it was born. The enemy was not merely being killed. The enemy was being eternally neutralized. The philosophy underlying these actions is chilling. Western civilization views death as a line. Life ends, the line is drawn. Plains belief, however, perceives death as a door. Behind the door lies a new plane of existence. Had Custer's men entered through that door with all their equipment and physical integrity, the danger to the tribes would have persisted. The army of the dead would have regrouped. These rituals were a customs control established at the threshold of that door. The soldiers' weapons, muscle strength, and mobility were confiscated at that customs. The difference between butchery and surgery is purpose. What was done on that hill was not butchery. The bodies were not haphazardly chopped. Internal organs were not disemboweled. Faces were not rendered unrecognizable. The focus was entirely on the cancellation of motor functions, joints, ligaments, tendons, and fingers. Every mechanism of the body that moved, generated power, and caused harm was delicately decommissioned. This was a clinical crippling operation. When examined from the perspective of battlefield forensics, the placement of the cuts possesses a terrifying anatomical accuracy. The mark was never missed. The dull thud produced when knives cut through tendon echoed hundreds of times in the valley. It was repeated like a ritualistic incantation. Every soldier's body went through the same standard protocol. The procedure time had been optimized. Time was running short, and there was much work to do. The women knew the structure of the bones and the placement of the muscles by heart. The effort expended to get under the skin was minimal. The angle of the knife was adjusted according to the direction of the muscle. This knowledge was not passed down in university lecture halls, but through centuries of hunting and warfare practices from generation to generation. Human anatomy was being struck at its weakest points. The sun's rays faded as they struck the shredded muscle tissues. The drying blood formed scabs at the edges of the open wounds. The scene on the hill was a document of biological ruin. But for the tribal women, this scene was a guarantee of security. When they finished their work, not one of the 210 men would be able to stand up in the next world. None of them would be able to clench their fists. None of them would be able to touch a trigger. The elite soldiers whom the American government had spent millions of dollars to train, equip, and send into that valley had been left eternally helpless on a cosmic plane. This cold-blooded logic is proof that war is not won only in the physical world. The Battle of the Little Bighorn might have been won with weapons, but the decisive victory was sealed with those obsidian knives severing the tendons. The warriors killed the soldiers. The women destroyed their spirits. A two-stage, flawless, and ruthless annihilation plan. A doctrine taught in no military academy in the Western world, found in no strategy book. Not merely defeating the enemy, but erasing his existential threat from the universe. The surgical intervention carried out in that freezing silence was history's most ruthless preemptive strike. George Armstrong, Custer, lay near the highest point of the hill. His body had been stripped naked, like the other soldiers. The sun illuminated his pale skin. Yet the procedure applied to him was entirely different from the soldiers around him. While over 200 bodies surrounding him had been dismembered, Custer's limbs were intact. His scalp was in place. His golden blonde hair had not been flayed. This difference was not a sign of respect. He held a specific rank that distinguished him from the rest, and this rank required a specific punishment. The ritual to be applied to him did not target muscles or tendons, but directly the senses. One of the tribal women approached Custer's body. She did not hold an obsidian knife. She held a thick needle carved from bison bone, its tip flawlessly sharpened. The woman knelt at the commander's head. Custer's face bore that dull expression, brought on by death. The procedure was not performed on arms or legs. The target was directly the skull. The bone needle was aligned with Custer's right ear canal. The woman struck the back of the needle hard with the heel of her hand. The bone drove through the flesh and cartilage. The tympanic membrane, the eardrum, was pierced with a mechanical coldness. The tip of the needle plunged deep into the inner ear. The same procedure was repeated for the left ear. The hammer, anvil, and stirrup bones were crushed. The auditory nerves were physically destroyed. In the physical world, this was a completely deafening intervention. But in the spiritual dimension, it served the exact opposite purpose. This act was not savagery. It was an immensely heavy cosmic message. Custer had sat at the table with the tribes while he was alive. He had made treaties. Papers acknowledging that the Black Hills belonged to the natives had been signed. But when the gold rush began, he had heard none of those words. The noise of his own ambition and American expansionism had made him deaf to the promises he had made. Now, that deaf stubbornness was being broken. Those bone needles impaled into his eardrums were not wounds. They were spiritual hearing aids. The tribal women were correcting this cosmic injustice. Those needles were plugs forcibly keeping the spirit's auditory canals open. In the afterlife, there would be no silence for Custer. He would have to hear the echoes of the oaths he had broken for all eternity. His spirit's ears had been forced open. His body was being deafened, while his spirit was being condemned to eternal noise. Rather than physical pain, it was a massive operation of spiritual poisoning. The commander was being made a prisoner of his own lies in the next realm. While the ritual continued on the valley floor, there were also exceptional islands where these strict rules suddenly stopped. Right in the middle of the massacre, there were bodies left without a single scratch. This situation would later be documented with clinical bewilderment in battlefield forensic reports. The most striking of those untouchable bodies belonged to Captain Miles Keogh. Keogh, too, had been killed like the others. His body was naked, but his limbs had not been severed. His tendons had not been torn. His fingers were in place. Among hundreds of dismembered corpses, he lay as a rare anomaly, preserving his biological integrity. The reason for this was not Keogh's bravery. The reason was a small piece of metal hanging around his neck, a silver Agnus Dei medallion, a religious symbol depicting the Lamb of God, belonging to the Catholic faith. The tribal women saw this medallion as they stripped off Keogh's uniform. They did not recognize it. They had no concept of Christian theology, yet they felt the spiritual weight radiating from that object. In plain, the logic of the ritual came into play here. To interfere with a body bearing a dark talisman would draw the curse of that talisman directly onto the practitioner. A single cut inflicted on that body could release the foreign and toxic spirit inside it. The tribal women did not take the risk. The systematic dismemberment process bypassed Keogh's body. His biological integrity was preserved thanks to that small silver object around his neck. This was not a show of mercy. It was entirely a theological security protocol. A vessel harboring an evil spirit was not to be touched. That vessel was left alone with its own darkness. A similar immunity applied to some privates carrying strange ink marks on their skin. There were soldiers who had been sailors before joining the American Army, or who had pagan symbols engraved on their bodies. They had anchors, mermaids, or geometric figures on their arms. To the tribal members, these tattoos were not simple decorations. They were demonic seals etched into the skin. For the knife to cut through that ink meant releasing that diseased energy beneath the skin into the air. Just like the bright colors of a venomous animal, these tattoos were read as warning signs. Those bodies were also left as they were. Amidst the scattered heaps of mutilated flesh, they remained whole thanks to the ink upon them. When the Army's medical units reached that hill days later, they recorded this scene. Dr. Henry Porter's military autopsy transcripts are clinical historical documents. The reports clearly state the condition of Keogh and the tattooed soldiers, yet the American mind proved utterly incapable of grasping this selectivity. Army doctors and military officials interpreted Keogh being left intact as the profound respect the natives felt for his warriorhood. This was an attempt by the Western world to create its own myth. It was a highly romantic and entirely incorrect assumption. There was no respect involved. There was only a spiritual terror and meticulous avoidance. The American army could not read that deep and complex theology in their enemy's belief system. They evaluated the battlefield purely on an axis of bravery, fear, and savagery. They had coded the Indians as primitive, whereas every action on that hill, every intact body left behind, and every cut inflicted was the result of a theological equation possessing mathematical certainty. The bone needles impaled into Custer's ears and the medallion around Keogh's neck were two sides of the same coin. On one side, eternal punishment was operating. On the other, a shield of protection against the unknown. The autopsy reports of Western civilization could describe muscles and bones, but they could never see that it was actually souls being operated on upon that hill. The destruction of the physical body was only one half of the equation. When the biological ruin was complete, the objective of the operation suddenly shifted. Anatomical dismemberment was replaced by the systematic annihilation of identity. An American soldier did not carry his existence solely in his muscles and bones. His true armor was his uniform. Blue wool jackets, brass buttons, yellow striped trousers, leather cavalry boots. These garments were not merely pieces of fabric to protect against the cold. They were corporate identities dressed upon the individual by a modern state. The uniform was the physical manifestation of the contract binding the man to the state. The tribal women had to tear this contract to shreds. The stripping process began. This was not simple grave robbing. It was not a mundane case of theft at all. This was an operation to completely erase the spiritual and psychological presence of the American army from that hill. This time, the knives cut through wool fabrics, not skin. Jackets were forcefully pulled out from under the dead weight. Trousers were peeled off bloody legs. Brass buttons were ripped off along with the cloth. Rank insignia were torn away. The process advanced with the same clinical coldness once again. Not a single piece of clothing was left on the dead. The 210 men on the hill were left stark naked as the day they were born. This nakedness was far more than a biological fact. It was a state of absolute vulnerability. A heroic cavalry regiment had been reduced to a pale mound of unidentified flesh in seconds. The uniform determined the hierarchy on the battlefield, the only thing separating a captain from a private, a sergeant from a corporal, were the yellow embroideries on that fabric. Nakedness destroyed this modern hierarchy in a single stroke. Ranks evaporated. Military discipline collapsed. None of those pale bodies, beginning to swell under the sun, were commanders or soldiers anymore. All the titles the state had given them had been ripped away along with their clothes. That massive military mechanism, built by the white man, had been reduced to naked and nameless cadavers on the banks of the Little Bighorn River. When a man loses his uniform, he is only flesh and bone. The tribal women condemned the American army to precisely this pathetic reality. Leather cavalry boots, in particular, were systematically pulled from their feet. Those boots were the fundamental pillar of an American cavalryman's stance, his civilization, and his power. Without them, soldiers turned into mere civilian mortals, completely defenseless against nature. The sight revealed when the boots were removed was another layer of psychological devastation. Soft, white, and delicate feet that had been enclosed in combat boots for months, having never touched the wild earth. This image was physical proof at a forensic level of Western civilization's true weakness against nature. The bare feet were the clearest indicator that the soldiers never belonged to that geography. Those feet would never walk again. The shoes, meanwhile, were tossed aside to find their new owners in the tribal camp. As the bodies were stripped, what spilled from the pockets were not merely spoils of war. They were the tools the Victorian-era man used to cling to life. Compasses, maps, leather wallets, and paper money. The tribal members could not read those meaningless lines of engineering on the maps. Paper money held no material or spiritual value for them. Their geography could not be drawn on paper, and their blood-watered lands could not be sold for money. These objects were viewed as trash remnants of the dead soldiers' meaningless and weak world. Some fluttered away in the wind. Some mingled with the blood and soil. The rationality that emerged from the pockets of the American dream became utterly worthless in the dust of that hill. However, some specific items were carefully gathered. The gleam of metal and that complex allure of mechanics drew the interest of the surviving warriors. Gold pocket watches, silver chains, medallions. Even if their functions were not fully known, these items were seen as symbols of power. Gold watches torn from the dead officers were examined with cold-bloodedness and bloody hands. That faint tick-tock sound they produced, like the beating of a mechanical heart, was a strange and supernatural whisper to the tribal members. These small metal boxes were the white man's effort to imprison and control time. And now that imprisoned time was changing hands while its original owners lay swarming with flies on the earth. When the stripping and sorting process was finished, the hill fell completely silent. The tribal women and warriors withdrew slowly towards the valley at an unhurried pace with the spoils they had gathered. The scene they left behind was the bloody tableau of an army destroyed not only physically but ontologically. Uniforms, weapons, and mechanical tools were gone. All that remained were 210 wounded, dismembered, and stark naked human bodies. None bore a name tag. Ranks were lost. Affiliation had been reset to zero. The colossal arrogance of Western civilization had been turned into a flayed and butchered skeleton upon that hill. This was a situation transcending the parameters of battlefield forensics. This was a total annihilation of identity. The spoils were carried to the massive tribal camp across the river. Just a few hundred meters away from the lethal hill of war, there was an entirely different, vibrant world. Life went on among the teepee tents. The fires had already been lit when the warriors returned to the camp. There were no hysterical cries of victory or savage dances around the tents. A silent, solemn, and ritualistic acceptance prevailed. The brought items were piled around the fire. Blue wool jackets with bloodstains not yet dry were spread on the ground. Leather boots were hung on the ends of poles. The hierarchical identity of the American army began to be slowly and ruthlessly melted down within the daily practical life of the tribal camp. When the darkness of night descended, the atmosphere became utterly surreal. The flames of the campfires created massive, rippling shadows on the surfaces of the leather tents. Hanging from the warriors' necks were gold pocket watches taken from dead American officers. These men measured time according to the sun, the cycle of the seasons, and the stars. Artificial, mechanical concepts like seconds or minutes did not exist in their worlds, yet now they were carrying mechanical time machines on their chests. The crimson of the fire gleamed on the metallic surfaces of the gold watches. The mechanisms continued to run. The functioning had not stopped. Tick, tock, tick, tock. This sound created an eerie contrast within the camp's nature-intertwined silence. On the dark hill across the river, the hearts of 210 men had stopped completely. Their bodies were growing cold. Their blood was clotting, their muscles entering rigor mortis. Yet these miniature mechanical hearts that came from their pockets were still beating around the campfire with the same military discipline. Every single second marked the irreversible vanishing of the dead soldiers. Time progressed linearly for the white man, but their bodies had already begun to rot on the hill. Those mechanical clicks in the camp area were the strangest forensic finding the war left behind. The gold pocket watches worked flawlessly, yet the owners of those watches did not have a single second left to spend in the world. The fate of the objects was tossed in a direction diametrically opposed to the fate of the bodies. The bodies were left naked and defenseless, abandoned to nature's merciless biological cycle. The objects, however, changed hands and joined the practical world of the tribe. An officer's most intimate possession, the photograph of his family, turned into a piece of paper a child found meaningless. A captain's compass was used not for finding direction, but solely for the feeling of magnetic fascination created by the spinning needle inside. The rationality of Western civilization collapsed completely around the campfire. Logic was taken out of the loop. Scientific instruments turned into totems. This transformation was the final stage of the American military identity being utterly dismantled and swallowed by another reality. Custer's soldiers had been scraped from history not only physically but as individuals. Their existence was reduced to the ticking of a watch echoing in the tribal camp. 48 hours passed. On that silent hill above the Little Bighorn River, the ruthless rules of biology had long since come into play. The date was June 27, 1876. The sun scorched the naked and dismembered bodies like an oven for 2 full days. The tribes had left the area. All that remained was that heavy, deafening, and organic reality of death. A massive feast had been set for nature's scavengers. Flies, maggots, and crows were at work to complete the biological ruin left unfinished by the tribal women. The cold and systematic spiritual surgery of the war was over. Now only a process of pure decay was underway. The relief unit under the command of General Alfred Terry approached the valley from the south. The soldiers had not yet seen the hill, yet they felt the hill long before. The wind blew upward from the valley floor. There was a sweetish, heavy, and pungent smell in the air. This was the smell of hundreds of rotting human and horse corpses. The biological signature of death slammed hard into the face of the American army from miles away. The soldiers' horses grew restless. The animals did not want to go forward. Their instincts whispered to them the horror they were approaching. Terry's vanguard units climbed to the summit of the hill, and at that second, time completely stopped. The scene they encountered was not a military battlefield. This was hell vomited onto the earth. 210 men lay swollen, blackened, and unrecognizable among the grass. Skins baked under the sun had stretched like balloons. The bodies bore the marks of that chilling spiritual surgery, rather than the holes torn by bullets. Severed Achilles tendons, intentionally detached trigger fingers, disemboweled muscle tissues. These mounds of meat, left stark naked, were once the most feared and supposedly invincible cavalry regiment in the world. Now they were merely ordinary biological waste infested by insects. The silence on the hill suddenly broke. Tough American soldiers who were experienced and had seen bloody wars dropped to their knees. They threw their weapons to the ground. They began to vomit everything in their stomachs. Sounds of retching echoed in the valley. This was not just a physiological reaction to the unbearable stench. It was a massive and devastating psychological collapse. The human mind could not process a systematic defeat of this magnitude. These men were accustomed to hand-to-hand combat, bullet wounds, and classic death. But they were not prepared for their comrades in arms to be mechanically dismantled on a giant open-air autopsy table. What they saw shattered their own belief systems, the power of their uniforms, and their perceptions of civilization in seconds. It wasn't just the nauseated soldiers vomiting. The arrogance of Western civilization was vomiting on that hill. That unshakable sense of invincibility of the American military mind was emptying its stomach. The officers had great difficulty pulling the privates together. The chain of command broke momentarily. They could not look at the faceless, eye-gouged, muscle-butchered bodies of their own commanders, their fellow ranks. General Terry immediately understood that this horror would create a lasting trauma in the mind of the army. This scene had to be eliminated urgently. The physical evidence of death and that cosmic defeat had to be urgently buried under the ground. The order to enter was given. However, the process that began was not a military funeral ceremony. It was a hysterical panic and a concealment operation. The soil of the hill was hard as rock. Spades struck sparks as they hit the ground. The holes dug by the soldiers were only a few dozen centimeters deep. They had neither the time to dig real graves nor the psychological strength left to wrestle with that earth. The aim was not to honor the corpses. The only aim was to get those mutilated bodies, reduced to nothingness, out of sight as quickly as possible. The naked, swollen bodies missing their limbs were hastily shoved into those shallow pits. A little dirt and sagebrush branches were quickly thrown over them. Many of the bodies could not even be completely covered. When the wind first blew hard, that thin layer of soil would fly off, and bleached bones would reemerge under the sun. The American army was not burying its own dead. It was frantically covering up its own theological fiasco. That hill was turned into a shameful mass grave. This deep shockwave was not confined just to the scene. The United States of America was celebrating the centennial of its independence right in those days. A massive industrial exhibition had been set up in Philadelphia. Steam engines, continent spanning telegraphs, gigantic steel wheels were on display. The white man was at the peak of the technology he had invented. Right in those days, the first telegraph from the Little Bighorn reached the East Coast. It was like a poison plunge into the heart of the nation.
Thanks for watching Let's Dance Stories, and see you next time.